apologize to, I should now apologize to the AI transcriber since I talk really fast and am likely ever to change.
Welcome, Dr. Filler. Please begin. We're delighted to have you here.
So this talk and my own eventual big philosophical claim, which will come at the end, emerged from a very specific moment, the publication of Michael Walzer's 1985 book, Exodus and Revolution, which perhaps some of you have read. Though quite a short volume, it opens with a grand claim. It is a book, as Walzer says, quote, about an idea of great presence and power in Western political thought, the idea of a deliverance from suffering and oppression, this worldly redemption, liberation, revolution. We still, Walzer asserts, quote, have much to learn, I think, from a close study of the Exodus. The biblical narrative that Walzer and I will call Exodus does indeed begin in the Bible's second book, with the ominous note that, as the verse says, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. But the narrative in its fullness extends into the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as well, describing the commandments given the Israelites at Sinai, their long sojourn in the wilderness before finally arriving in the promised land in the book of Joshua. Walzer's focus, therefore, is on the sustained political afterlife of the extended Exodus narrative, by looking closely at the variety of ways that various people and communities have understood themselves, as it were, to be walking in the Israelites' footsteps. These reinventions of the biblical narrative, as Walzer calls them, are chiefly, this is his quote, the work of religious men and women who found in the text not only a record of God's actions in the world, but also a guide for his people, which is to say, themselves. Perhaps they were wrong, but that is not for me to argue. Within the sacred history of the Exodus, they discovered a vivid and realistic secular history that helped them to understand their own political activity, end quote. Edward Said's fierce response in the form of a long book review essay is animated by his resistance to Walzer's thoroughly normative opening claim that we still have much to learn from the Exodus. Said's critique can be situated in two pointed questions. What exactly is it that we can learn from the study of the Exodus? And who precisely is the we in question? Said's essay was sufficiently influential that perhaps it forms part of the Walzer canon itself now. In any case, they are often read together. I think that both Walzer and Said would describe their dispute as political, a characterization that becomes even clearer in the ensuing exchange following the publication of Said's critique. This later exchange is somewhat less intellectually illuminating, consisting as it does largely of arguments about the history and governance of the state of Israel, interspersed with personal insults. But Walzer's book and Said's essay are both thoroughly hermeneutic in their approach, which is to say that the debate turns on a question of basic textual interpretation and the consequences of that interpretation. Inasmuch as Said thinks Walzer has made a grievous political error, the error has textual roots, and the roots, as it were, are showing. But I want to argue ultimately that Walzer and Said actually share a deep, though unspoken, assumption about how the Bible works on people and communities of readers. They both assume, for better or for worse, that there's necessarily some direct relationship between the biblical narrative and its readers' actions. That is, they both assume that to make biblical narrative interpretive claims is already to endorse or criticize some politics, such that to say what something means is also to know its normative force. It's this foundational and generally unquestioned assumption that I myself ultimately call into question, all in 35 minutes. In his introduction, Walzer lists a wide array of causes and communities that have invoked the Exodus narrative, from Cromwell and the Puritan Revolution, Lincoln Steffen's Moses in Red, a biblically inflected defense of Soviet revolutionary politics, Latin American liberation theology, the modern Jewish Zionist movement, American abolitionism and the civil rights movement, the Boers in South Africa, and more. Of the latter, for instance, Walzer notes both that, quote, the book of Exodus came alive in the hands of Boer nationalists fighting the British, and it is alive in the hands of Black nationalists in South Africa today. That is, he refers to the anti-apartheid struggle. But while Walzer shows himself through his book to be obviously more sympathetic to some political causes than others, he's a believer in liberal democracy, he's definitely not a Leninist, he clearly finds the persistent biblical theme powerful. as he says, this is his quote, "Wherever people know the Bible and experience oppression, the Exodus has sustained their spirits and sometimes inspired their resistance." His stated goal, therefore, is to demonstrate, as he says, that, quote, "the text is plausibly understood in political terms as a liberation and revolution, even though it is also, in the text, an act of God." Walzer is relatively careful in his introduction to note the limitations of his approach. Though he intends to, quote, "expound the Exodus as a paradigm of revolutionary politics," and I ask you to underline in your heads the word paradigm, there's no overarching theory here. Rather, he says, quote, "the Exodus is a story, a big story, one that became part of the cultural consciousness of the West, so that a range of political events, different events, but a particular range, have been located and understood within the narrative frame that it provides. This story makes it possible to tell other stories." That's his quote. The bulk of Walzer's small book, then, is a roughly chronological account of the biblical Exodus narrative, from Israelite slavery in Egypt and Moses' emergence as God's voice, to the plagues and the eventual flight across a temporarily tamed Red Sea, to Sinai, to decades in the wilderness and into the Promised Land, read so as to draw out the political themes Walzer sees in the text. Two of Walzer's chief observations also underscore the political nature of the text, by which I mean broadly the development and contestation of power by individuals and institutions. He notes early on that the Exodus narrative has two notable and distinctively political features. First, although it is emphatically a text that depends on divine interference, the extended narratival character includes an immense amount of human action and conflict. Despite God's obvious heavy hand, Walzer notes, quote, "the Israelites are not, after all, magically transported to the promised land. They are not carried on eagle's wings of Exodus 19. They must march to get there, and the march is full of difficulties, crises, struggles, all realistically presented, as if to invite human as well as divine resolution. The thoroughly political character of the nature is attested to by its difficulty and by careful attention to the times when God acts decisively, when God does not, when the Israelites act contrary to God's wishes, and so forth." The second distinctive and political feature of the narrative, Walzer argues, is its notably forward-moving arc, which is to say the story departs from other ancient tales of travels that end in some sense where they began. Homer's Odyssey, for instance, ends on the hero's own doorstep from whence he began, greeted by his long-suffering wife, his servant, and of course, his faithful dog. But the Exodus begins with the Israelites in slavery to Pharaoh and ends geographically and existentially in quite a different situation. This too, Walzer argues, is crucial to understanding the Exodus's political allure. What is promised, he says, is radically different from what is. The end is nothing like the beginning. The Exodus, Walzer says, quote, "is a journey forward, not only in time and space, it is a march toward a goal, a moral progress, a transformation. The men and women who reach Canaan, that is the promised land, are literally and figuratively not the same men and women who left Egypt." Here he refers not only to the fact that most Israelites of the initial liberated generation die in the decades-long wilderness trek, but also to the collective transformation of the people from a beleaguered mass of recent ex-slaves to, among other things, an army in fighting shape and led by God, ready to enter and conquer the land on which many other people and peoples are dwelling. Though on its own, this might yet indicate a relatively descriptive project, Walzer's broad admiration for the biblical themes and its theopolitical influence is undeniable. Walzer's concluding words are entirely collective, prescriptive, and admiring, and they are also the first text on your sheet. The well-known last paragraph of the book concludes, quote, "we still believe, or many of us do, what the Exodus first taught, or what it has commonly been taken to teach about the meaning and possibility of politics and about its proper form. First, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching." These are the best known words of Walzer's well-known book. They're also reprinted in somewhat adapted form in Mishkan Tefillah, the chief Siddur or prayer book of the Reform movement, the largest American Jewish denomination. And I gave you a kind of a screenshot from Mishkan Tefillah, so you can see how it is that the quote is transformed. You can no doubt see why the words have made their way more widely into the world. They reflect what Walzer has made explicit. The Exodus narrative, in some fundamental sense, is about us. Walzer Exodus inflected political action is not simply a historical phenomenon, but a political prescription. Walzer's conclusion invites us to understand ourselves for some value of ourselves as not only generally formed, but politically authorized by the narrative. As he says, there is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. I would like to consider, though, the interpretive assumptions that make Walzer's conclusion possible. Assumptions that I ultimately want to suggest, like 15 minutes from now, may have serious unintended political consequences. First, and importantly, in Walzer's normative summary, there is one important actor missing: God. Walzer's analysis is obviously secular, he says this himself, but to know this is essential to understanding his normative move. In the biblical text, after all, God intervenes in extraordinary material ways and is consistently physically present, providing divine sanction or divine rebuke. This is, of course, not the case in the same literal sense in post-biblical movements. And this includes both self-consciously religious movements and also readings like Lincoln Steffen's analysis of the Soviet Revolution, which admits no divine presence. Relatedly, and this is important, Walzer's approach must assume that the broad details of the narrative may be understood in universal or paradigmatic terms, as opposed to more limited semantic terms, without losing anything of immense narrative or political significance. The major actors, themes, and geographies of the narrative: Egypt, Pharaoh, Israelites, slavery, wilderness, promised land, must be able to legitimately stand in for many different times, locations, and political experiences. If, wherever you are, it is probably Egypt, Walzer suggests, and indeed endorses, that there are many different yous and many different Egypts. For the text to work, as Walzer describes and ultimately exhorts, it must be disaggregated from its immediate context and specific details. The major themes of the narrative must be sufficiently generalized that the identification of one's own community with the Israelites seems natural and felicitous, and a given liberatory struggle comparable to the distinctive experience of the Israelites' divine extraction from slavery. That is, it must feel correct to read the Exodus narrative not only about them, the Israelites, but also about us, whoever that is. Now, I think that Walzer himself would likely not dispute this characterization. He makes no claim to be a biblical scholar or historian of the ancient Near East. And in any case, as a historical matter, he is surely correct that this is indeed how the Exodus narrative has indeed often functioned. Clearly, for instance, the Puritans obviously did see themselves in the narrative, while presumably not incognizant of the difference in details between themselves and the ancient Israelites. But I think that for Walzer, this paradigmatic approach is morally necessary as well. After all, the biblical account itself is brutally violent. I assume that this is an uncontroversial characterization of a text that includes the befoulment of the Nile and all potable drinking water, the destruction of livestock, and of course, the smiting of every firstborn male Egyptian. And that's before the Israelites even leave Egypt. This kind of thoroughgoing destruction is not presumably what Walzer means to endorse when he exhorts us to join hands and march. Rather, it is the general themes of liberation, communal self-determination, and so forth, abstracted from the biblical narrative, that may serve powerfully as the template for political action. Thus, we can perhaps understand Walzer's approach in conventional liberal terms. The biblical narrative is driven by live interactions between various people and God, with often quite bloody results. But the broad themes, notably absent direct divine intervention, can serve us too. To abstract away from the details is to create a more general Exodus narrative with more palatable political terms. It is this abstracted thematic account that Walzer calls Exodus politics. This interpretive orientation, however, forms the basis of Edward Said's quite ferocious review essay, pointedly subtitled A Canaanite Reading. Canaanites, of course, being the people named in the biblical narrative as currently residing on the land soon to be conquered by God and his Israelites. To Walzer's paradigmatic approach, Said responds by dramatically opening the Hebrew Bible himself and arguing that Walzer's universalist approach does not admit the importance of many of the text details. Walzer's progressive conclusion, Said charges, is only possible if the Exodus consists only of extremely general themes. According to Walzer, Said says early on, we are fully entitled to reject anything about Exodus that smacks of mere territorialism, since what matters is the deeper argument proposing that righteousness, and not the coarse act of holding the promised land, is the only guarantee of blessings. I understand Said's objection to mean something like the following. A close reading of the Exodus narrative certainly does emphasize that the God of the Israelites has a singular obsession with placing them in the promised land, them and no one else. But Walzer's insistence on the paradigm of Exodus, as opposed to its narrative details, allows Walzer to blur the rather more specific or troubling details of the text in favor of a putatively deeper paradigmatic analysis. The Exodus narrative from Egypt to the conquest of the promised land is full of destruction, of people, land, and animals in service to the Israelites and their God. A reading, Said argues, that ends with an exhortation to join together and march in the model of Exodus has moved very far from the biblical text. Reading Walzer, he says with characteristic bite, quote, you begin to wonder how the world has become so malleable and so possible a place. This book, Said charges, is in fact dependent on implicit but extremely severe excisions and restrictions, that's his quote, in order to produce the calmly civilized world of Walzer's Exodus. And yet, and this is the Said quote of which I gave you in its full context, Walzer is making very strong assertions about revolution, progress, peoplehood, politics, and morality. It is not as though he were just an avoider and a deferrer. In fact, a fog is exhaled by prose to obscure those problems entailed by his argument, but casually deferred and avoided before they make trouble. The entire review is like this. As a review, Said notes that in his discussion of the Israelites' long period in the wilderness, Walzer, quote, cuts from consideration all the material in Numbers and Leviticus in which we find the God urging revoltingly detailed punishments for offenders against this law. None of this makes it into Walzer's account. Here, Said refers, of course, to the commandments given by God to Moses and the Israelites at Sinai and in the wilderness after, the basis of the new conditional covenant between God and his one chosen people. These commandments, as most of you know, extend well beyond the best known first 10 and become exceedingly specific. Consider Leviticus 20, chapter 20, verse 9, on your, which is on your sheet, which instructs, if anyone insults either father or mother, that person shall be put to death. That person has insulted father and mother and retains the blood guilt. These chapters are full of these. I should say I chose just this one as an example because I knew that my mother was attending. But there are others which are themselves quite comparable for many verses. Said actually engages in a bit of political analysis of verses like these himself, suggesting, quote, it seems to me unescapably true that during moments of revolutionary fervor, all the monotheistic religions propose unforgiving, merciless punishment against actual or imagined enemies. Punishment formulated by perfervid clerics in the names of their one deity. But Said's broader point is that Walzer's account of Exodus politics is quite a bit less murderous in its normative understanding of the wilderness than the actual biblical text. It seems unlikely, Said says dryly, to expect that the kind of secular and decent politics Walzer salvages from Exodus could coexist with the authority of the sole divinity, plus the derivative but far more actual authority of his designated human representatives. Walzer's selective and paradigmatic approach is all the more disturbing, Said argues, when we consider some of the groups that have seen themselves in the Exodus narrative broadly construed. Walzer declines, for instance, to focus on the means by which the Israelites 40 years on take possession of the Promised Land, by divinely instructed force, indiscriminately eradicating, at least in the first half of the book of Joshua, the land's present inhabitants and claiming the land. Yet this part of the Exodus narrative is essential, Said argues, for some of the text's most prominent later users. This is his quote, "From Indian killing Puritans in New England to South African Boers claiming large swatches of territory held by Blacks." Against Walzer's inspiring account of communal liberation in the Exodus paradigm, Said argues, quote, "This does not suggest a very elevated model for realistic politics, and it isn't clear how the dehumanization of anyone standing in Moses's way is any less appalling than the attitudes of the murderous Puritans or of the founders of apartheid." But despite their very great political differences, some of which emerge more explicitly in the ensuing back and forth, I argue that they share an assumption much deeper than they realize. First, they both assume that the semantic plain sense, the most basic interpretive sense of the text in its semantic and contextual, the semantic plain sense of the biblical narrative, they assume, may pose a problem to the politics they wish to endorse or reject. In Walzer's case, he evinces this by departing very significantly from the basic semantic meaning of the Bible. This is a matter of both practical necessity. He cannot endorse the paradigmatic of use of Exodus without it, and a political one. The exclusionism and violence of the narrative must be, let's say, blurred for him to make any plausibly progressive claim that we ought to join hands and march to the Promised Land. The Promised Land is only universalizable and politically acceptable if it does not involve divinely led conquest and genocide. But Said, for his part, reveals the same assumption in his attempt to repudiate Walzer on textual grounds. His method for disputing Walzer's conclusions is largely just by citing various biblical verses that describe exclusionary violence or conquest and pointing out how obviously non-progressive they appear. Said fashions his critique by pointing to the text's plain sense and expressing his skepticism that these verses can plausibly give rise to Walzer's meaning. And of course, as further evidence, he points to groups like the Puritans, the Boers, who saw themselves in the Exodus by, among other things, entering lands and dispossessing the native inhabitants. For Said, with Bible in hand, such groups are better examples of people who have actually adhered closely to the actual biblical narrative. To point this out is for Said a sufficient criticism of Walzer's more optimistic and necessarily blurrier approach. But, and now I will shift a little bit to the philosophical, it is just this shared assumption that the plain sense of the narrative testifies, as it were, against itself, that I want to suggest is unwarranted. For the biblical text in its plain sense to be a problem, we must assume, as both Walzer and Said do, and as is a completely embedded assumption in many Jewish and Christian reading communities, that to offer a biblical interpretation is already to make some kind of normative claim for readers who call the text sacred. I'll say again, the assumption requires us to think that to offer biblical interpretation is already to make some kind of normative claim upon communities of readers. That is, for readers who take the biblical text seriously as a sacred or foundational document, the assumption is that to say what the text really means is also to know what it means for us. This idea accounts both for Walzer's approach and Said's critique. Walzer, for his part, depends on an abstracted account of the Exodus narrative for his normative conclusion. That kind of interpretation is the only one whose normative political significance Walzer can sanction. So the plain sense will not work for Walzer's politics. But for the same reason, Said's approach, simply pointing to the text's plain sense, violence, and exclusion, appears to him to be sufficient critique. Because if that's what the text says, and what the God of the text appears to endorse, then to Said, it is fundamentally or assumed to be entirely reasonable for someone acting on the text to act violently or exclusionarily. This is not the only way to think about textual interpretation, even in communities thoroughly committed to the sacrality of the Bible. Rather, I suggest the inverse. The more closely we read the biblical text, the more attention to its contextual details and language and location we pay, the more the text is about itself and not about us. That is, the more carefully we read, the further we, whoever we are, stand from the Israelites in ancient Egyptian bondage in a world awash with miracles and God leading the way. For better or worse, the text in itself makes no gesture to us. It is about them. Put another way, the more real the narrative seems, its vibrant details underscoring its particularity, the less able we may be to abstract away from it enough to insert ourselves. The more specific and distant the text, the less immediately authorizing power it has. Consider, for instance, and this is the last text on your sheet, Moses' threat to Pharaoh in Exodus 11, after God has declared his intention to bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. In the chapter's opening verse, to Pharaoh, Moses says the following, "Thus says the Lord, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every male firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such has never been or will ever be again. But not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at human or beast, in order that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." Whatever else these verses do, they surely call into question the idea that in this text, God's partisanship for the Israelites emerges from a principled objection to slavery. Every firstborn male of Egypt will die, we read, from one born to the architect of the Israelite suffering. Yes, this is expected, this makes sense. To one so thoroughly removed from the levers of power that after her, the final category is not even human. The soon-to-be grieving mother laboring behind the grain grinder is even marked as a slave herself. After the invocation of this human devastation, the destruction of animals is ludicrous in its gratuitousness. In chapter 12, when the plague is carried out, the description replaces the slave girl with another utterly powerless. In the middle of the night, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. In view of these verses in their immediate context, the claim that the God of this text has a principled objection to slavery is less tenable. The passage also includes a key that does make intelligible the impending disaster. The infinite distance between the Israelites' experience and the Egyptians is so that, quote, "you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." By this metric, the other differences between Pharaoh and the slave girl are insignificant compared to what they share. They are Egyptians. But while Said might be happy to wield passages like this against Walzer, he is not as self-evidently correct as he imagines. This text and any violent or troubling biblical passage only pose political or ethical problems to the degree that we, the readers, are able to bridge the vast distance between our world and the world of the text, and determine that the narrative is normative outside its immediate context. That is, we must assume that it is speaking not only about them, but to us. But I do not think that the text itself invites any particular bridge. It is aggressively about these people, Israel and Egypt, and this setting. In fact, this passage actually includes a specific detail to underscore its singular nature. There shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as never been or will ever be again. You couldn't recreate it, even if you wanted to. I want to be clear that I am not dismissing all modes of interpretation beyond the basic semantic. But I do wish to argue that the more aggressively we hew to a plain sense interpretation and to its details, the less able we are to make any instantaneous connection, for better or for worse, between the text and our own world. Instead of reading for general themes or putative moral command, communal attention to the narrative in its plain sense acts as a kind of guardrail against over-identification caused by more shallow reading. This is particularly important in light of Said's argument regarding Exodus-inflected colonial expansion. For Said, perhaps the ultimate problem with the Exodus model, in his view, is the ultimate endorsement of expansion suggested by the Israelites' violent conquest of the Promised Land. Said, of course, invokes both the Puritans and the Boers to demonstrate the phenomenon, and of course, I should say, he has still another conflict in mind as well. Said critiques Walzer's eagerness to disconnect Exodus politics from what Said calls the essential parts of Exodus that have inspired the Boers and the Puritans. But in its most basic semantic sense, the text authorizes no one other than they who act within it, the Israelites. Said is eager to ally them with a more accurate, violent reading of the Bible. But of course, an immense amount of, let's call it, expansive interpretation is necessary for the Dutch South African Boers to connect their context to that of the Israelites. Such identification requires no fewer interpretive gymnastics than any of Walzer's other historical examples. The more literal, or to put it more provocatively, the more fundamentalist the reading, the less the text admits anything outside itself. By way of conclusion, to be clear, the plain sense of a biblical text is not necessarily any more self-evident than any more consciously political or analogical interpretation, as the history of Jewish interpretation certainly testifies. That is, a plain sense hermeneutic is not necessarily intellectually easier. We do not necessarily have any more agreement about what the text in its basic semantic sense means. But I do suggest that the orientation toward plain sense reading of the Exodus, attentive first and a sustained way simply to its basic semantic meaning, offers its own kind of freedom from the obligation to busily transform the text into something whose normative force we find acceptable before we have even considered simply what it has to say. We, the reader, can enter into the Exodus narrative and offer our interpretation without imagining that our conclusions commit us to any particular ideology or political and ethical act. This turn, a commitment not only to go back to the sources, but also to stay there, may be its own kind of political or ethical intervention. And with that, I thank you and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Filler. What a challenging and thought-provoking presentation. I will bite my lip and resist the urge of the moderator to ask the first question. I am more than happy to take questions from the floor. It looks like Professor Mannequin, would you be able to start us off?
Sorry.
There you go.
I wrote to Max, put me in line on the assumption there were a lot of people before me. So I apologize. Well, thank you very much. There's so much to say. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and which obviously goes well beyond the announced topic, because basically from your own conclusion, you're really making a very broad statement about the legitimacy, or perhaps the preferred nature of any sort of biblical interpretation, or any sort of interpretation of any text, which is maybe a historical text, it could be the Constitution, it could be whatever, in which one draws lessons for our times. And I would just like to say two quick things. First of all, even a hermeneutics which is going to focus, obviously, this is the obvious things, hermeneutics which is focused on what you call the semantic, in context, I'm going to say it, with Spinoza as my guide, like the history of the text as much as you can within the framework, obviously is going to, we are who we are, so we are the interpreters, and so we're obviously going to have, that's sort of a trivial point, but even that's going to, there's going to be an interpretation there, and it's obviously going to be contextual because it's always going to be read by a reader who has a certain context. But I would like to say just a few words in terms of, in praise of shallow interpretation. Because as you know, I mean, that's really the history of certainly rabbinic, well, any classical text which has had interpreters, you know, whether I'm going to focus on the rabbinic tradition, but it doesn't have to be. Up until now, I have a feeling that Walzer might have had less difficulty had he been more aware of the points that you're making and the fact that it could be read, obviously it could be read differently. I don't think that, I mean, there are always going to be people, I think of Herman Cohen, who's going to say, this is what the Bible means. And no, you can come up with this. Yeah, it means it. But really, I can tell you, I can understand the ethical monotheism inherent in the Bible. And that's really what we're getting at. Granted, it's obviously in a more primitive version, etc. I think Walzer would obviously be sophisticated. I remember when the review came out, I spoke with him. I happened to be, Yehuda Kurtz are still here. I happened to be at a Hartman conference that he was on. And I asked him, well, what do you think of this review? And his reaction was, I was surprised. Like, where did that come from? I think there was a certain naivete of Walzer as he was discovering these sources and becoming increasingly interested in the Jewish political tradition, and that naivete is almost typical of, well, our field, which is Jewish philosophy, but it could be anything like that, in which one looks for what the Bible is teaching us. And I don't think that he would write that book. I mean, obviously, needless to say, this is much more interesting in terms of if you're doing a study of Walzer's thought than if you're doing Walzer on the Bible. But I don't think he would write that nowadays. And that's the point I wanted to ask you about. If he had showed a little more sensitivity to the fact that what he is doing is clearly an abstraction, that he's not making claims of, this is what the Bible teaches us, this is what we can learn from it, but this is our reading in which we're going to abstract by all the elements which are anti-liberal and, you know, super religious, and including, you know, the Canaanites and the massacre, the you know, commandments for extermination and peoples, etc. He might have been able to ward off that criticism. And I'm thinking in terms of, again, this is the last comment, in terms like, you know, Isaiah Leibovich, the Israeli philosopher, was always asked the question, well, you say that this is what X means. This is how you're going to read Exodus. But don't you know there are like a lot of different people say different things. And your interpretation is only one of the interpretation. He would say, oh, absolutely. I'm not making a claim that this is the teaching of the text or that this is the teaching of the scripture. I'm making the claim is this is the text as I find it interesting. I find that it can speak to us.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is when I say in praise of shallow interpretation, as long as one at least gets out front that what one was doing is obviously very interpretive and highly selective and cherry picking, that may help. Otherwise, I'm out of a job.
Yeah. So Chip, I first want to tell you that was like 10 questions. So
yeah, I know, sorry. I'm not very good.
All right. And I think you said something important. I do first want to note actually that I actually do see this in some sense as a Leibovichian project. In the same way that Leibovitz rejected the idea of instrumentalizing halacha for ethics, I think I see that kind of paradigmatically to what I'm doing. But more generally, here's what I think about Walzer, and you can tell me what you think about this. I actually would suggest, and again, we can play with this, that part of what gives the critique of Walzer its bite is that once one identifies oneself with an Israelite, with the Israelites, because they understand themselves to be in some like situation of danger, there is nothing that stops them from being Israelites when they enter the promised land. So the identification of oneself with the Israelites doesn't stop, as it were, at the Jordan River's edge. And so what this means is that sort of the God of the Israelite liberator, of the Israelite liberation, is also the God of the conquest. So I actually think that this approach itself might sort of paradoxically be more, the paradigmatic approach might be more likely to lead to the kind of results that Walzer wishes to disavow. Precisely because once one is an Israelite, you're an Israelite, as it were, all the way. And there's nothing that stops you from continuing to identify with the Israelites paradigmatically when you enter the promised land. So in a certain sense, I think that Walzer's approach, which I'm not unsympathetic to, is in some ways sort of animating my own critique here, in as much as it has kind of unintended political consequences. Does that maybe begin to get a little bit at what you're getting at?
No, I mean, yes, it does, and I agree with you. I think it's very difficult to do what I call cherry picking, to do the sort of like we're going to select what we can learn from it, and the other stuff we're going to either ignore or just bracket as saying it's not going to be relevant.
Kind of universalist, and
yeah, and right. I mean, I just one more thing. I mean, yeah. I don't remember how he answered Said. I mean, the obvious answer is, can a Canaanite read Exodus and read it in this universalistic way? I mean, not qua Canaanite, that's the whole issue. But qua anybody who is, if everybody's in Egypt, so the Canaanite is also in Egypt.
That's right. Wherever you are, it is probably Egypt. Yeah. On the other hand, I wonder if that might be the stopping point for Walzer. I mean, the Canaanite is by definition sort of not in Egypt. I'm not sure, and he does say in the text, and Said points at this, that in the biblical text, the Canaanites are excluded from the world of moral concern. But theoretically, that is the best answer he has, that the Canaanites too are in Egypt, and in the same way that both the Boers and the anti-apartheid activists understood themselves in Exodus terms, so too could the Israelites and the Canaanites understand themselves in Exodus terms.
I'm going to be quiet because there are other people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, please do keep sending in, either you can send me questions directly if you don't want to ask, or you're welcome to put questions in the chat, or just let me know if you want to speak. We have a question about this idea of going back to the text and staying there. And it's a seasonal question, because another text, Chip knows where I'm going, another text from this season, from a later date.
In every generation, we are commanded to consider as though we ourselves have gone out of Egypt.
Yes, but so my question is not for you to resolve these two, to resolve the literary parallels of these two things, or the literary challenges of them. My question rather is to say, how do you go back to the latter text and stay there? How do you engage with a very different agenda of the rabbis using a similar strategy? And can you do a kind of deep shot of that? And then as a contemporary philosopher, how do you negotiate the conflicting literary cultural heritage of this double contradictory deep shot? Is that a good question or a go away question?
No, it's an excellent question. So the is a kind of all-encompassing sort of nodding.
Excellent. The all-encompassing
Yes. So no, it's a great question. And I maybe I'll ask it again in the following way. There's another kind of parallel communal tradition that commands right around this time. In every generation, one should consider oneself as though one had literally gone forth from Egypt. That is, that one should kind of literally sort of hear oneself as, or think of oneself as an Israelite. So there are a couple of things to say about this. The first thing, interestingly, is that the Haggadah actually does not tell the plain sense story of the Exodus. The Haggadah actually gives us something quite different. And of course, the context for the Haggadah is not Exodus, but people talking about Exodus. So the sort of frame of the Haggadah is four rabbis sat all night in Bnei Brak, telling the story of Egypt. And when morning came, their students came to tell them it was time for prayers. So I think actually, for what it's worth, I actually do think that for all the kind of performances of being an Israelite, the frame of something like the Haggadah is actually in some sense sort of removed from the world of the world of the Exodus. And the other thing I'd note, by the way, especially vis-a-vis conquest, is that the claim is in every generation one should see themselves as though they'd gone forth from Egypt. It doesn't say in every generation one should see themselves as one who entered Canaan. And of course, like that absence is embedded in the liturgical tradition as well, right? We read from the end of Deuteronomy, and then immediately we turn around and read from the beginning of Genesis. So there's interesting, like, so kind of a tradition in which, like, we liturgically we never enter the land as conquerors or anything else. But I do want to say I think this is a kind of ongoing question. I don't want to claim it could just be that in some sense the rabbis think about this different, that I'm not exactly their heir. I will say that I think there is some way in which the general rabbinic tradition is very useful to what I'm saying, because what I think a kind of obvious question is, like, sure, fine, we can do a very close and what we might call a literary or contextual reading of the Exodus, but anyone can do that. We could do the same thing to any other text, and we could like do a good literary analysis of like today's New York Times. Don't do that, but what I actually want to suggest is that there's a kind of, the rabbis have gifted us a kind of metaphysical a priori by embedding such an emphasis on reading to the tradition. So if nothing else, the idea that you can sit and read and read and read, and that's its own virtue, right? That's in a way how you discharge your duty. That's lishma, is already actually embedded in the tradition. So maybe in that way, I'm in a kind of continuity with the rabbinic tradition, if not in other ways.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take other questions from the floor. I only have about 15 more questions myself, but that would be rude. Are there, you're welcome to put your hand up if you'd like, using the hand up feature. Chip, do I see you? Oh, you're muted, Chip. Are you still processing?
No, I just came back. That's all. I sorry, I went out and went in, but I'm let other people go at it.
Well, I'm intrigued. I mean, I will out myself here as a religious studies person rather than a philosophy person, which means that I might use all of the same building blocks, but create a very different Lego structure. And I'm wondering if you can talk about if you could say a little bit more about the ethical implications of selective reading. We all read selectively. Selective reading is a project. Your description of Saeed's project of selective reading is very powerful. It suggests that he has competence and also an agenda. And I was a little curious about your view of Walzer's competence with respect to the text, but I'm also really interested in the ethics of this. That's y'all's department, not mine. So if you would, say a little bit more about how you see the ethical project falling.
That's a great question. And people should feel free to keep asking this question because it's meaningful. I actually want to, I can make in a kind of dialectical way a very big claim, and then maybe I can dial it back if necessary. I actually want to argue that there is no obligation to at least consciously give a selective reading in service of some ethical or political agenda. I am happy to say or to endorse the idea that the text means only itself. It means only to itself. And we ought to make no assumptions about what it means for us. So perhaps maybe a little bit what I'm pushing back against is a kind of standard, I think, modern sort of liberal assumption that the text is necessarily a problem when it seems to authorize some kind of like ethical or political agenda that we don't wish to endorse. It's not clear to me that the text authorizes for us anything at all, or that we necessarily know, at least in a kind of a priori way, like what the relationship is between what we think the text is saying and what we think it's saying to us. Now, I should say that in a communal setting, this is complicated. For instance, I myself am very bad at giving Devar Torah, the kind of short sort of discussion about what the weekly Torah portion means, because I sort of refuse to kind of read something sort of abstruse from the Bible and say, so what does this mean to us here today? This makes me like really bad at Devar Torah in its conventional sense. But I actually want to suggest that ultimately it's better. First of all, we get to be better readers, which is to say sort of like more interesting or creative readers, because we're not, where the text doesn't represent to us a kind of perpetual stumbling block. At any point, we might sort of crash into something which is bad for us. And therefore we have to kind of like busily begin doing something else. So perhaps maybe in some sense, my argument is just about, first and foremost, like good reading, but is there a way of being kind of freed from the kind of ethical or political assumption that to read means necessarily to ally oneself with some kind of like political platform? I'll say, and this is maybe like very relevant, I first started thinking about these questions, and it's actually especially about the Exodus, when I was part of this reading group, like when I was in grad school. This was probably 8 or 9 years ago. But anyway, I was in this reading group with a variety of people, and a variety of them were Mennonites. So people committed to the Peace Church tradition. Anyway, we came to the text in Deuteronomy where Moses says the following, by way of God: if you keep my commandments, when you enter the land, you will live in houses that you did not build, and drink from wells that you did not dig, and eat from olive trees that you did not plant. It was at this moment that our reading group kind of splintered into 1,000 pieces. The plain sense is what it is. The text is unapologetically endorsing a kind of a eliminationist approach to the Canaanites in the land, who will soon be deprived of their olive trees, their wells, and their houses. The consonance with modern politics makes it even more nerve-wracking for people. But what I was interested by in this moment was that my Mennonite interlocutors, I actually thought seemed almost unable to read the text. So they were almost unable to see what the text simply says, which is that when you enter the land, if you follow my commandments, you will live in houses that you didn't build and eat from trees that you didn't plant. So it made me begin thinking about what the assumptions are that make the text always already a problem,
Right.
as opposed to a text that means itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome to Peter Oakes, who has an interesting question. Could Dr. Filler offer general comments on how the biblical text may stimulate specific traditions to read for action's sake? What hermeneutic may work? So in other words, thank you. That's wonderful. Now do the thing you don't want to do.
No, I know. I appreciate the question. Thanks, Peter. Look, I am not 1,000% convinced that that can be done in a way that is consistent. It is certainly possible for us to read in various ways and to, in direct senses, derive an ethics or a politics from them. I don't think this can be done consistently. So the method by which we might derive an ethic from some verse is not likely to transfer over to the biblical text as a whole. What I do think, and I realize in some ways this is very fierce. What I do think is that a kind of practice of perpetual reading is itself a kind of an ethical practice. But I think I do want to sort of insist on a kind of radical indeterminacy in terms of how it is we know how any given text will act on us. So I assume that the more we read something, the more it kind of gets inside of us. And this is part of, I mean, speaking of modern biblical scholarship, this is important for people like Northrop Frye and others who are really interested in what it means to kind of live in the narrative, or to think of oneself in a kind of narrative way, as embroiled in the text. I assume that when we read anything, but certainly when we read something like the Bible, that is working on us all the time. I don't think I would want to make any more direct claim than that in a consistent way. I recognize what this does. I recognize that it has great losses. And I don't mean to suggest this is the only way that you can read, but I do think at least that a kind of aggressive commitment to, what I say, going back to the sources and staying there, at least sort of stops us. Right? It's a kind of extended speed bump that stops us from going too quickly from, let's call it, from the peshat to the drash, in such a way that we don't even recognize that we've done so.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We have several questions. I must say the very last thing you said made me think of Confederate statues. And I just, you're where you are in Central Virginia, I think that there's something very powerful about thinking of the thing where it is and where it was, and really struggling with that and sitting with it.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I'm kind of on record as saying, the text is there for you to kind of fight with it. Yeah. But I do want to say that it's not necessarily a fight. I mean, fight already still implies that it has a kind of a priori controversiality, and that's only true if we're working already with some assumption that the text can kind of activate us in ways that we don't want to. Whereas I think I'm trying to like interrupt that connection altogether.
Yeah, the entire hermeneutical circle becomes a place for contestation.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think if we think about the text, we think about the interpretation, we think about the action. I think that both Walzer and Said, so you see, I've brought peace between them. Both Walzer and Said, and I think most like modern liberal traditions and maybe illiberal traditions as well, work with the assumption that the text, there's no distance between interpretation and action in some way. And so if the text is a problem, then you already on your hand have an ethical or political problem. I don't think this is necessarily true. I think the text says what it says, and there is a much wider gap between the interpretation and the act than we imagine, or there can be. We can train ourselves to think this way. And so part of what's interesting to me about the Walzer-Said debate is the degree to which they both take this very much for granted, such that for Said, and Said's not wrong about Walzer's approach, and nor would Walzer, I think, critique his own approach on those grounds. So Walzer agrees, he is reading paradigmatically. Said imagines that to say, I'm looking at the text and this is what it says, is itself a kind of sufficient critique. But I don't see why that should be so.
Excellent, excellent. Zachary Berger, would you like to ask a question or make a comment?
Sure, great talk. I want to sort of rephrase a question that's been asked by others probably better. But I want to go back to what you said about your relationship to the rabbinic tradition. And the text meaning itself is, in a certain way, very much an anti-midrashic approach, right? Where per midrash, the text means nearly anything else. And this radical indeterminacy makes me question or wonder what your theological approach is. And I think you specifically were not theological in your claims. But if part of what's underlying, I think, politically, your resistance or your understandable skepticism to a priori ethical claims to the text is sort of a bridling at received verities. So theologically, would you think that your thoughts are supporting a kind of continuous revelation model? Or is this sort of, is that too far a reach to pin to you theologically?
That's real. No, that's real. I mean, I think in some sense, one way to understand, I guess, what I'm saying is in some sense, kind of a continuation of a political project or a theological or interpretive project of someone like Martin Buber, right? So, I mean, Buber is interested in what it means to have this sort of continual and surprising interaction with the Bible. And in fact, of course, the distance between his sort of middle class German speaking context and what he calls the kind of raw Hebraic text is a virtue for him, because of this it has the sort of continuous ability to kind of strike you or surprise you or destabilize you, and the text is supposed to be, as he says, unheimlich, right? It's it makes you kind of uneasy all the time because you realize sort of you're really not there, and this is the kind of undomestication of the text against what he thinks someone like Luther has done, which has made the Bible, the German Bible, kind of aggressively German. The Midrash question, I think, is important. So it's maybe at least useful to say that the tradition makes a distinction between peshat and drash. So you might be right; it's a little non-midrashic, but it's not as though even by calling it drash, the tradition, I think, sort of names itself as doing something other than peshat, other than the plain sense. And then sometimes, occasionally, reflects on its own method and says that's why we're doing this. Having said all of that, I actually do think sometimes midrash actually doesn't quite work as a sort of a smoothing or ameliorating factor. So I'm thinking right now of a passage, and actually Abraham Joshua Heschel talks about this one, in the commandments as regards the freeing of a slave. If the slave has served his 7 years, he can be released, he can be kind of manumitted, and if he wishes to stay for whatever reason, then he's sort of like marked on the ear as sort of belonging perpetually to his master. Now, there are lots of ways to kind of ameliorate the ethical meaning of that, but I actually don't think that's what the Midrash on a text like this does. Actually, what they do is go deeper into some of the details. So the discussion is actually not ethical at all. It's about questions like in which ear should the awl should the awl pierce? Or what if the slave in question is also a priest? Is he de-priested by being marked? So in some sense, I actually think that that's actually an example of kind of leaning into the details in this way, or sort of insisting on the importance of the details in a way that does have a kind of deferral of ethical decisions. So the rabbis never conclude in this particular passage whether or not it's good that the Hebrews have slaves or whether or not it's good that they can be maintained in perpetuity by their masters. Rather, actually, they kind of lean into the details as a kind of deferring factor. That actually, I think, is quite consonant with what I'm thinking about. So the details itself are sort of slow down all kind of ethical or political conclusions. And that actually can be a kind of ethical virtue if you're, say, like an ancient rabbi who doesn't wish to endorse slavery, but also doesn't wish to depart from the text. You can sort of spend 2 generations talking about like which ear. Does that answer your question, Zach?
Yeah, that was great. That was very informative.
Thank you so much. Paul Shem, would you like to make a comment or ask a question?
Sure. Thanks very much. As a historian, I'm somewhat unfamiliar intellectual territory here, but I'm very intrigued and I've been following it closely. But you told a story before you didn't finish. What did the Mennonites do about their problem? If you venerate and believe the text and you have an absolute anti-occupation, both philosophy and theology, I assume they didn't go mad or renounce their faith. How did they deal with this?
No, that's a great question. These poor Mennonites, I mean, they really inspired me in ways that they didn't necessarily mean to. But it was actually a very informative exchange. So in this case, and this I think actually was quite formative intellectually for me, the Mennonites' approach was actually to put aside the text, to say, yes, the text is sacred, and we certainly affirm it, but as it were, we don't wish to talk about it right now. So actually, the reading group actually sort of splintered over this, in as much as the other assumption wasn't tenable. They didn't wish to either desacralize the text, nor did they wish to affirm what they imagined was the implied normativity of the Israelites as occupying power. And so, like, the sort of best way was to sort of put aside the text, and to only sort of like think largely communally as opposed to interpretively. So in some sense, I actually thought that was very that was indicative in some way. When the text is a problem, what you lose is the text. So and this is why I think actually the rabbinic tradition is quite useful, even if in some ways like it is maybe a kind of departure from some rabbinic norms. The rabbinic tradition gives us a model of what it means to keep reading over generations, right? No matter what, you can always do that. You can always keep reading. And in fact, you can indicate your fealty to the text or the tradition simply by reading it, or we would say by learning it. And so for that reason, the worst possible thing in the rabbinic tradition that you can do is stop talking, or just stop talking about the text. That is absolute poison to the post-biblical rabbinic tradition. That seems to me to be very illuminating. You can do whatever you want with the text, but you can't put it aside. So I think if nothing else, the rabbinic tradition gives us that, a kind of metaphysical a priori that the text occupies a particular place in a given community, and therefore you must keep reading it, if nothing else. Thank you for your question.
Fabulous. Professor Manikin, did you want to jump in?
Well, in a sense that last comment sort of anticipated what I wanted to say. I was thinking of a reader like James Kugel, who is an expert on Bible, and he's certainly a person who has written a lot on modern biblical scholarship. But he also writes that without being he claims he's also coming from a traditionalist perspective in some ways, without mediated by the rabbinic tradition, the Bible isn't actually a very uninteresting book. I mean, it's like an ancient. It's interesting in the sense that it exists, as an ancient text, but something nobody possibly would want to learn through, and quite inferior to other texts of that time. Yet this is a man, obviously, who spent his entire life, his professional life, reading the Bible, and I think that's. Of course, his claim is that it only becomes mediated by a tradition, call it midrash. It doesn't have to be rabbinic. It doesn't have to be ancient, but it's in mediation. It becomes interesting, and that, of course, solves problems. That, as you mentioned, solves the problems about what do you do with some of the things that might have bothered the rabbis, which don't bother the biblical authors. Yep. On the other hand, of course, it also avoids another comment, I think another suggestion you made, which is how much we can learn from the Bible just reading it in its own terms. Well, I wanted to go from Kugel. I wanted to ask you, but then again, you said that you basically affirm some sort of midrashic.
Here, I'll sort of like, I'll kind of think about it this way. First of all, I think Kugel is wrong. I think the Bible is fascinating. And I mean, I think it is narratively fascinating. I think characteristically it's fascinating. So if that is the kind of basic assumption, then I think it's false. And I'm sure Kugel thinks that as well, but of course, like
maybe he
the
didn't
rabbinic
say
tradition
that
does things for him that are useful, right? I
think he might have meant that there are enough quote problems in the Bible that it wouldn't be used unmediatedly as a guide. And this
actually, to that, I would be happy to say that's exactly right, James Kugel. And that, in a sense, is its great virtue, that it is given to us as a kind of metaphysical a priori for a community. And so we're in it, but we don't know what to do with it. So in a sense, we can kind of be in it. We can sort of appreciate it as a sort of bizarre and violent and sacred production without having to kind of immediately begin this process of transformation.
Yeah, and apologetics and
that's right. I mean, which in a sense, I think ultimately just sometimes makes you just a worse reader. Now, I want to be clear about one thing. The kind of obvious question to me is something like, yes, the Boers and the Puritans, but also there are also all the other movements. I mean, or all the ways in which people understand themselves to be kind of activated by the text in ways that I think are better. I am willing to say that I think we do not require the text to work for us in a particular way in order for it to be interesting. But I don't mean to say something like, you know, the civil rights movement understood itself often very much in a kind of biblical light or in light of particularly something like the Exodus narrative, right? We think about someone like Dr. King saying, you know, I've been to the mountain, I've stood on the mountain, and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you. I think this is a kind of an interesting rhetorical move and powerful. I don't mean to undermine it. All I mean to say, which is a lot, I realize, is that there's a profound virtue to sort of pausing for a kind of long time with the text itself, and seeing how it acts on you, because we don't necessarily know.
Yeah, and this I can just, if I just follow very quickly, this is really, I think, a lesson of, if I may, speaking as an old guy, a lesson of the age. I'm reminded of Moshe Greenberg, who was the American biblical scholar, when he went to Israel. Wrote a book on Joshua because he saw that people in Israel hold the whole religious movement of Gush Emunim, was reading Joshua as a blueprint for extermination and conquest. And having lived as an American Jew, he was entirely, this is back in the, I guess, late 70s or 80s, he was entirely unaware that there was a contemporary Orthodox religious movement that was taking it quite literally. So there has
although
been,
I would actually say not. So I would actually say,
well, yeah. I mean, obviously using it for appropriating a quote literal reading for its quote literal for its own purposes. And so I think that what one finds, I mean, this is not my area. I do the 12th century, but I think Maimonides, don't forget, talked about divine accommodation. But it certainly seems to me that there is, at least in response to this naive, quote, literal reading, there's been a great attempt on to look for those classical commentators who are reading it in a different light and trying to make it more palpable.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I mean, as regards Walzer and Said, ultimately their argument is really about Israel. So that is, of course, what's actually happening in their debate, and it becomes clear in the ensuing exchange. The sort of the veil is lifted, or the gloves come off, or some kind of metaphor, and as a result, it sort of becomes clear what the kind of geopolitical stakes are for them. But I should say, I also really recommend on this Rachel Haverlock's new book called The Joshua Generation, because I learned from this something which I never knew, which is that on the 10th anniversary of the creation of the Israeli state, Ben-Gurion convened a study group in his home, and consisting of Israeli politicians and military leaders, and then a few scholars and archaeologists, to read Joshua and to, in a quite conscious way, create a kind of Israeli narrative out of the text of Joshua. So in a quite explicit way, Ben-Gurion introduced the study group, which went on for like several months, as a way of creating a kind of coherent Jewish Israeli narrative out of Joshua. So which involved like Israeli military leaders sort of looking at accounts of various battles in Joshua and determining sort of like how the strategy would have worked, or like the minister of finance or something, kind of looking at like various sort of trading practices between the Israelites and the Canaanites, and sort of trying to determine how it was that this happened. So now, part of what's interesting to me about this, of course, is that like they understood themselves to go back to the sources, and they very explicitly understood themselves, as it were, to not be staying there. But also to be patterning themselves after the book of Joshua. And of course, it's notable that the book of Joshua is also very widely taught in Israeli state schools as well. So it's clearly functioning in the state in this way. But I refuse to countenance such an interpretation, for better or for worse, as a plain sense interpretation.
Yeah.
It involves as much interpretation as anything else.
Sure. Absolutely.
Right. And
Agreed.
also there were no Mennonites present.
There were no Mennonites. So
I'm intrigued by the problem of whether all these people are reading the same text. And I kind of want to put you and a biblical studies scholar in a room together and ask you to fight it out a little bit as well. Blair French, did you want to make a comment or ask a question?
No, I think Emily's answered it. I was just interested in I guess the only thought I had was I was wondering why the Mennonites didn't go to an allegorical reading, which is often sometimes the case. And although it seems to me that an allegorical reading is almost, in terms of when I think of what the early church fathers did in reading what they considered to be the Old Testament, how they obliterated so many problems that way, and whether that stands at the opposite end of the kind of thing you're talking about, and whether looking at the other extreme sheds light on what you are attempting to do.
thank you. That's really important. I mean, the Mennonites are really maybe their own chapter in this book now, I'm thinking. There's a couple of things I think interesting that happened with the Mennonites, and they're maybe quite instructive. The text itself is so contemporarily resonant. They'll live in houses they didn't build. They'll drink from wells they didn't dig. They'll eat from olive trees that they didn't grow. You could not imagine a more damaging set of verses in a contemporary geopolitical a more contemporary geopolitical context, as regards, of course, the debate that Walzer and Said are ultimately having about Israel. Interestingly, I think that given that they were also somewhat squeamish about immediately becoming analogical, in as much as it sort of took them out of the realm where they could also talk sort of generally about like political justice in the land. So once you speak analogically, again, it's difficult to then immediately say, but also we're going to really speak in a very grounded or material way about this land and political justice in this land. You've sort of trapped yourself in the analog. So I wonder if that's part of what made a text like that so so demanding of them.
Would you like to respond?
Thank you very much. No, that was great. Thank you.
This is wonderful. This is just really challenging. I am a classroom teacher, so I have a bad habit of calling on people. Eli Saltzman, would you like to jump in? Would other folks like to jump in? Okay, I hope I'm not abusing my role as chair. I feel like I have so many questions for you about this. I mean, I just think that some of what you're doing is so important because it's challenging not only text, but context. And you're insisting that texts be understood in light of the realities of contexts that are temporally and perhaps even ethically multiple. And I'm going to ask a really, really ignorant question.
Yeah, please.
How does the discipline of philosophy, as opposed to, for example, Land of Israel studies or biblical studies, ancient Near Eastern studies, religious studies, how does your work as a philosopher force you and allow you to engage with the text in specific ways that other scholars would not? This is what I meant about putting you in a room with a biblical studies person.
No, I mean, I think that if I can answer it sort of thinking about biblical studies, one thing that I am kind of comfortable with that a biblical historian would not be is, in a sense, a sort of overarching literary approach to the biblical canon, right? It for communities, it functions more or less in a unified way. Or this is what Robert Childs and others call a canonical approach to the biblical text. And for the purposes of thinking this way, I actually think that's fine. One thing that I actually might criticize in some biblical studies, if I can like have the chutzpah to criticize other fields. I mean, or one question that I might ask is, isn't it interesting that biblical studies, that often sort of one stated goal of biblical studies is to demonstrate that such and such a text is ahistorical, for instance, or is actually an amalgam of two different texts, or actually the word means something different. Very often in a kind of explicit way, that kind of biblical history is used in service of ethics, right? So the text, like my training in biblical history can give me the biblical scholar sort of authority to say that the text actually doesn't mean what it seems to mean. Now, I think actually, I find biblical history endlessly fascinating, but I should say, interestingly, I actually think this accords also with Walzer and Said's assumption that if the text is a problem, then that's always already a political or an ethical problem. And therefore it has to be fixed. And isn't it lucky that we have modern historical tools that can help us do so? So far be it for me to call any kind of like historical claim into question, only to say that most communities read, as it were, as communities, with a kind of canonical approach. The text is a kind of unified literary production, at least, or a unified canonical production. And in any case, I don't think the text needs it. So the badness of the text can stand on its own without it necessarily having any particular kind of authorizing intention. And I should say, actually, it's interesting. I mean, this is why I was interested in this really quite damning text, the last text on your sheet from Exodus, because I thought that this is a text that really insists on its own distinctiveness. You will know that the Lord makes a distinction between these two people. You will know that a cry will be heard that will never be heard again. It's very aggressively local in its description. And so I thought in some ways it's a kind of technicolor example of how I would invite us to think of the entire text.
Thank you. Wow. Well, you've given us a tremendous amount to think about. I'm still going to be thinking about the ethics of this and how it works in the real world. I want to thank you very, very much for bringing these insights to us. Round of applause from all of us. We have hit our time, so if people need to leave, that's fine. If anyone would like to do that milling about for a moment, you're welcome to unmute or show us your faces. But I will say thank you so much. And we will look forward to seeing everyone towards the end of the semester for a celebration of the mannequins. We're going to have a little mini conference, and you'll hear more about that soon, in celebration of Chip and Rachel Mannequin, who are retiring if we can't tie them to their desks and keep them here. Many thanks to everyone, and thank you especially, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you.